And then I'll take that one step forward and I'll give the snares backbeat, another backbeat. So it's the backbeats, backbeats, backbeat. And it creates this circular motion where your head is going around following these backbeats the entire time.
When you were talking about how you spent a bunch of time working on those glitchy drum packs, it was starting to crystallize in my mind why your drums sound so freaking good. When you guys hear his new EP, which I got a little taste of a few hours ago, you will agree with me. Like, the drums are straight up like cone sound level, punchy, crispy, clear, and I'm not exaggerating. They're like twice as good as mine. Would you mind Would you mind diving into a little bit of your drum processing?
So the first thing is sample selection. It's also really critical to make sure your drums have diversity in the flavors that you're using. I talk a lot about drum processing with my students because a lot of kids come to me like, how do you snare layer so well, blah, blah, blah. So that's one of my favorite things to talk about. But namely, like the main thing about, are we talking groove or are we talking about samples, actually? Because it's really important to get the actual groove of a drum track down before you even make it sound nice.
Oh, I think my question was more focused on processing. Groove tends to be more, well, ambiguous, taste-based, right? But objectively, your processing is really good. So let's focus on that.
Okay, cool. So essentially, if I'm going to start with when I start with something, I really just try and feel that back and forth push and pull swag of a beat or of a groove with just the kick, the snare, and the hi-hat. And if I'm not feeling that back and forth, what we would call like meter in music, if I'm not feeling that push and that pull right off the bat from just those three things, I'm informed that those three things aren't working. And once I get that really dialed in, I start to decorate the snare, because a really, really important part of good processing is making sure that that snare unfolds along a sort of poetic grammar, in which I mean that each snare hit varies from one hit to another so that it feels like there's differentiation. When your drummer is coming down with his stick, it's going to hit a little bit closer to the center of the snare, a little bit closer to the rim, et cetera, et cetera. So the human ear rebels at repetition. We need to trick the linear computer into incorporating human error. And so I'm always trying to find new ways to do that with snares in particular, because a snare over a 4-minute song at 140 BPM is going to land about 200 times. So we need to make sure that that shit is interesting from hit to hit. So what I'll do when I'm doing snares and I have them unfold along this, in quotes, poetic grammar, is I try and do like linear poetry. So line A, line B, line A, line C, line A, line B, line A, line D. And I make sure each one of those letters is a slightly variable snare. So the things that I look for when I put different like decor on top of my snares, or different layers on top of my snares, will be finger bells or different hat sounds, maybe different kinds of shaker panned left and right, maybe a different kind of pre-transient, or I'll even alternate reverbs. So it might be like buka-tuka ka, buka-tuka ko, buka-tuka ka, buka-tuka ka. And so that way each one has a slightly different hit. But after I do that and I come up with like 4 or 5, for each track, I usually make 8 different snares with the same body and same fundamental, but a different top layer. And then I glue it together using a glue compressor with the settings of the slowest attack time, a relatively quick release, about 2 or 0.2, 0.4, and then a 4-to-1 compression ratio. And so once that's all really glued, and I'll makeup gain that and drive that up so that the transient is really fucking sharp and cymaticsy and just like a punch to the face. Once I have that, I bring the rest of the drums up through compression to meet that snare. So whenever I'm doing, I have a formula that I follow for leveling that just doesn't really, it's an objective approach to subjective mixing. So I will mix my drums to make sure that my kick and my snare are exactly the same volume peak-wise, and then I'll bring the hi-hats to be 12 to 10 decibels quieter than them, cymbals 14 decibels quieter than them, and I literally hit these thresholds every single time, and then I'll compress it to a place where the ear agrees. So I'll do group compression using parallel glue compressing, and I usually do something, I compress the fuck out of it, and it'll be like let's see. So the time signature on that will be the fastest compression time with the second fastest release time, usually a 4-to-1 compression rate. And I'll mix that in parallel on my drum group. And then I will start to bring up that compressed signal more and more and more. So usually about -9 decibels quieter than the rest of the drum group. And that just really thickens up the drums. And then sometimes, if needed, I usually fade the transients off of my hats because I don't think hats need a lot of sharp transient. But if that is needed, I will go back in with the transient shaper and I will make the transients even sharper and more cutting because I like really high fidelity drum impacts. I'm not a huge fan of kind of lo-fi music. So for Cryptochronica sound, at least, I want my drums to cut really clearly. And something that needs to be said here while we're talking about this sort of transient playing is I'm a big fan of linear drumming, which means I like it so that only one transient impacts my mastering chain limiter at a time. And I make sure that even if I have a hat land on top of my kick, that hat has the transient faded off so that the kick's transient is the thing that cuts through the limiter. Because transients, when they both hit up at the same time, if you have a hat transient landing at the same time as a ride, at the same time as a snare, they're either going to do one of two things. They're going to phase out, or else they're going to peak together and sum to this huge transient explosion that's just going to register as distortion in the limiter. So I try and make sure that one transient hits at a time, and I focus on the transients a lot. But a lot of it's just making sure that there's differentiation and variety and detail in the drums, using all kinds of like delays, lasers, and reversed sounds.
It is abundantly clear why your drums sound so good. There is so much detail and care that goes into this. Take notes, people. I'm sitting here just eating popcorn like, oh, yeah, I'm going to try this.
You guys are making me blush. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about what's going on in the lives of Tesko, Rip Kenny, and Luke motherfucking Rain.
Sorry, Chris. We're gonna hammer you with questions. This is the Cryptochronica episode.
we know all about us, man. We steal all your secrets, man.
All right.
These are gems for real, and I love that you touched up on that, especially that part about, a drummer is going to hit that snare, and it's not. There's so many variables in the real world that snare is never going to sound the same. And I've had a lot of sessions personally where people will be like, why do my drums not hit? And all it is kick, snare, hi-hat, And so I'm really glad that you touched up on that. I know we wanted to keep this processing specific, but I would love if you had like a few short points that people can start thinking about when it comes to groove. I
was going to specifically ask you to go to groove.
Yeah.
We were done talking about
any little tips.
Okay, the snares sound incredible. How do we make sure people are actually dancing to those incredible sounding snares instead of scratching their head wondering why I can't dance to this?
Absolutely. Yeah, groove is more important than drum processing in my opinion, because you can get away with a song that's just like shuffly kind of groove, even though they sound really lo-fi and crappily processed or whatever. So for me, the thing that I make a mandatory first lesson for any student that does a session with me is iterative sequencing, and I talk about that in depth, where you start with a half bar sequence, you duplicate that, you consolidate the whole thing, and you change the second part of it. You consolidate, you duplicate, you change the second part of it. So that way you get this very coherent kind of drum syntax, drum grammar, where the cohesion from bar 1 to 2 to bar 1 to 5 makes sense in context with one another. And then you have these kind of like unfolding paragraphs of drum groove. So I always start with iterative sequencing. I think that's one of the secret DNA embryos of good electronic music, is doing that in every single instrument. So I make sure my sub follows iterative sequencing. I make sure my melodies and my rolls and my fills and everything is following iterative sequencing to some degree. When you're getting a groove, I will beatbox stuff out all the time. I will just beatbox like, and then I'll just start with that. But something that I've been doing a lot lately that works really nicely is, we've talked a lot about getting stuff off of the grid, and I think this is really important of everything but that main downbeat on the kick. So I will set my main kick downbeat, whatever the main groove kick is, to being on the grid, and then everything else will be shuffled off a little bit. So even like ghost kicks will be slightly early or slightly late, and I try and think of things in the term of either swag or snap. So in genres like house, you have a very snappy clap, which is a little bit early. And in genres like hip hop, you have swaggy kind of shuffly sort of beats where they're a little bit late. So I'll get my hi-hats a little bit late. I'll get my snares a little bit late. And I'll often make multiple variations of the tracks where I will just have my kick, my snare, and my hats, and I'll make like 2 or 3 different copies of that group, and I will just shift them in different directions each way, and I'll listen to them back to back, and I'll figure out which one is working for the vibe of the song, just by A-B'ing them from one to another. But something that's really quick to get really great grooves right off the bat is take a rim sound or take a hi-hat sound with a little bit of body and put the echo plugin on it with a little bit of delay, doing like a dotted delay note. Dotted is the sexiest time signature ever. It's just naturally groovy. You can't go wrong with an 8th note dotted delay. So I will put that on, and then I will vary up the sync timing so that it's like 33 seconds late or 32 seconds early or something like that.
I think you mean milliseconds, but I'm going to let you roll with it.
Definitely milliseconds. Definitely. Thank you for the correction. And I'll turn that on, and I'll let the feedback just play out over 4 or 8 bars, and then I'll record that, and then I'll extract the groove. So that way you can right click on different audio clips and extract the groove from them, or MIDI clips and extract the groove. And I'll save that to my groove pool, and then I'll use that for the entire song.
Run that back one more time.
So if you, I'll just start with a single hi-hat hit, and I'll put a echo on it. And echo is really cool because you can see unlike the delay settings, you can't really see the dotted or quarter note or 8th note delays. So say I want to do like 8th note hi-hats. I will put the echo on, and one of them will be 8th notes. The right side, for instance, will be 8th notes, and I'll put the left side to 8th note dotted or quarter note dotted or triplets. Those are fun too. And I will slightly untime them. So instead of being 0-0 as their sync setting, as their timing setting, I'll set it to like 15 and 22 or 35 or I guess 33 is as high as it goes, maybe 33 and minus 33. And that way the interplay of the groove is variable, and it's different than most people would come up with because you're letting the machine do the work. And so I'll just freeze and flatten that, and then I'll extract the groove and save that to my groove pool and use that in the project.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah, me too.
That's a gem right there.
Cool.
Yeah.
I hope I made that clear enough to follow.
Yeah. So then, follow-up question: when you have that groove extracted, and it's not gonna, it is a, polyrhythm of sorts where it continues a consistent groove, but doesn't ever, in my head at least, it doesn't ever really meet the starting point perfectly again. How do you use that groove to be a predictable, danceable swing then?
8-bar repetition. 8-bar repetition or 4-bar repetition pretty much invariably. So polyrhythms are the bread and butter of Cryptochronica. All of my arpeggios are in polyrhythms. I try and do my backbeats in polyrhythms. Oh, remind me to tell you guys about the backbeat. Let me make sure to tell you that, because that's a drum tip that I found a couple months ago that's just fucking amazing. Anyway, I will make sure that polyrhythms, because they get really confusing if they repeat too long without or if they go on too long without repeating, I make sure to repeat them either every 4 bars or every 8 bars so that your brain can restart on that position. But like I said, that main kicks downbeat, that one is just always on the grid, and that's a good anchor for the rest of the drums, is to anchor it to that kick on the main downbeat, and everything will kind of wrap itself around that moment in the song, so you always know where your head is going to come down. Okay.
Love it.
Yeah.
So yeah, go for it.
Backbeat. You guys ready for this? Let me see if I can explain this without Ableton in front of me. So I've been showing this to a few kids, especially the kids who are doing glitch hop, because this is like a glitch hop. Oh man, glitch hop technique that I basically discovered by listening to Bass Nectar really, really intensely, because it seems like every single one of his snares has this, and it's very, very subtle. But most of the time, the relationship between the kick and the snare are the two twin pistons driving the energy of the song. Boom to the right and clap to the left, and boom to the right and clap to the left. And that's that back and forth push and pull, that meter that we were talking about. Mm-hmm. But you can take this a step further and create circular rhythms instead of linear pendulum swing rhythms where you just go back and forth. You can create full 4-point circular kinds of rhythms by doing this backbeat technique. And it's super crazy. It's going to be really hard for me to articulate, but let me do my best. Essentially, instead of being like boom, cut, the backbeat, you give the snare a backbeat position, not the offbeat. You want to give the snare one more hit, usually using a similar kind of sample to the main snare, so maybe a rim or maybe a quieter version of the snare itself, in between the snare's hit and the offbeat. So right in that equidistant space between the snare and the offbeat, you put this backbeat, which would be the snare. Your downbeat's the kick, your backbeat's the snare, your offbeat is equidistant between the two. We all know those ones. The backbeat's backbeat, so the snare's backbeat, is that position equidistant between the offbeat and the snare itself. And if you use a similar sound to the snare, it feels really subtle. And so what I do is I will put like either a rim there, or maybe again a hat or a click. Clicks for glitch hop all the way. I'll put a click there, and I will pitch it off to the right or to the left, about 35 panning. And that way, instead of being like boom, cut, it's boom, kata, boom, kata, boom, kata. And it pulls your head off to the right. It pulls your head to that direction. And then I'll take that one step forward and I'll give the snares backbeat another backbeat. So it's the backbeats, backbeats, backbeat. And it creates this circular motion where your head is going around following these backbeats the entire time. So it'll be like boom, katataka, boom, katataka, boom, katataka, boom, katataka. And that, the further you pan it off to the right or to the left, you just want to make sure they're going in the same direction. So the first one I'll pan about 35 and the second one I'll pan 50 and make it even quieter. And that way my head follows the whole hit like that. It's almost like the snare has a delay but going off to one side, and your head will kind of just follow it and loop around in this really crazy circular motion. It becomes infectious and it becomes irresistible, and you'll find yourself moving in a circle whether you want to or not. I've been using that like crazy. I hope I made that clear.
Yes, love that.
Yes.
Mind blown right there.
Yeah. Yeah, and you made it super clear by beatboxing it. And I'm always a fan of beatboxing. I thought I knew what you meant, and then you proved it to me by beatboxing it for us. So thank you. Very well done. I like it. What's up, humans? It's Luke, your friendly neighborhood trap Jesus. Thank you so much for watching our videos. We appreciate you. Remember to like and subscribe to our channels. And if you have any questions or topics that we need to cover on the show, put them in the comments. Appreciate you. Peace, and peace among worlds.